I discovered the 8 immortal kings of Sumeria lived a total of 241,200 years. I have discovered through my research that these type of stories have an element of truth to them. Immortality is not only a possibility, but a reality. Could these people still exist in secret? Could they be watching? As there are numerous meanings to the various logos, names, and colors we use. One of the Hermetic principles is that the all is mind, the universe is mental. According to esoteric teachings, survivors of lost ancient civilizations seeded us through the mystery schools. Nearly all our great cosmological myths forming the foundation of the various sacred books of the world are based upon the Atlantean mystery traditions. Never dismiss a story because it is well known that such tales always have an element of truth to them. Have you ever read the story of Aladdin or watched a movie about how he finds a lamp and rubs it and a genie comes out and grants him 3 wishes? Well, genie comes from Jinn, and these ancient Jinn were spirits that we link to the Arabic or Islamic world, and we find legends and stories all about them in the Middle East. Well, to find out more about them, I recently traveled to the UK and I met with Harry Challenger, the publisher and editor of the Flying Saucer Review, and I wanted to see all his new and incredible research he's done on the subject. Check out the recent talk I had with him.
Okay, so many of us now live in multi-ethnic areas, so as a humanoid researcher, I will be coming into contact with many different Eastern peoples and Middle Eastern peoples, and particularly Muslims. And their main area of the paranormal is the Jinn encounter, which I'm going to call. Now that enters into what I call a forbidden subject, because there is a mystique around Jinn, which if you talk to the average Muslim and mention it, there's a reaction of fear and a question of if they reveal their encounters, whether they'll be judged, because it is considered an ill omen. So when people, for us Westerners, if we say a poltergeist, people just react, go, oh, poltergeist. Oh, I encountered an entity, I encountered an alien. Yes. Now, the cultural difference is a Jinn has some sort of weight to it that it's considered unholy to a degree, yet in the actual texts which people use to understand Jinn, which are all around the Quranic era, but they also predate it, I think there'll be things that were probably Persian and Middle Eastern and Arabic. These things come from a much older culture, and then they're reappraised in the religious texts. But they are actually open to their message of their prophet. So this first fundamental thing, that they're inclusive in the religious doctrine of Islam, is the existence of the Jinn. So these people, strangely, there's a contradiction. They accept the existence through their prophet, but they also fear the existence of the Jinn.
I've heard there's 2 types of Jinn. In Muslim persons that I've talked to, they said that there are Muslim Jinn that will come around Muslim people that are sort of acclimated to that environment. Then there's non-Muslim Jinn that are not familiar with them. And there are other interesting connections I've heard to the Jinn idea. So I was just talking with Timothy Hogan, who he is a great esoteric scholar, and he's the Grand Master of the Knights Templars, and he seemed to make a connection with, have you ever heard of the term how alcohol or spirits are called that because people who are drinking alcohol, it's sort of like an alchemical process, that they're more influenced, you could say, by different entities and energies, right? He seemed to make a connection even to the alcoholic beverage that we call gin, even though we connect that to
juniper berries. Yeah.
He made a connection over to juniper berries. Well, the idea with that's very interesting is that he said that there would be a connection with the gin over here to the gin that people drink. With these, do you think that this gin phenomena that we talk about over here, of them influencing people on a wide scale, do you think that is something that we find everywhere, and it's just called jinn in this area, or are the jinn a specific class of beings that are limited to let's say, a Middle Eastern part of the world?
Well, that's a good question, because as people moved out and basically we have gone into multicultural societies, the Jinn experiences have crossed the globe.
Yes.
So people are getting Jinn experiences now who live in the UK, they're getting them and living on the continent, and they're obviously getting them in Africa and other places. So there is a little crossover happening as well culturally, that some Hindus, because they're mixing a lot with Muslims, are also talking about Jinn encounters, because I've talked to some Hindus about Jinn, and they now have a more modern exposure to the concept. So it is definitely cultural. It travels with culture. It doesn't, I mean, otherwise we have like fairy experiences, which I also investigate.
I was going to bring that. You have an Irish background, and I was going to say that there's another connection that I was talking to a fellow recently. He believes that a lot of the Irish people that moved to America, they brought the fairies with them.
Well, funny enough, I did do a case where a guy had met basically a fairy kind of goblin man.
Wow.
And he was an American with British origins, and he had, for all intents and purposes, a folkish encounter with a small kind of leprechaun type creature who visited his house a number of times when he was a child. And for me, when I looked at it, I thought, this is classic Western folklore fairy people. It was like a little man with a suit, and he has a little hat, and he would come and play with this child. He was now a man. But
wow.
So that was a cultural crossover. So my view is these travel with culture. So if you haven't had an encounter with, I believe, Middle Eastern or even Muslim culture, it's less likely you'll have a Jinn type experience. You'll have an experience, but it won't pass into that bracket. So Jinn, as you say, why they say there are Muslim Jinn and non-Muslim Jinn, there's this evidence in the scriptures of Islam that they suggest that some Jinn had actually converted to Islam. So they would actually be part of the internal Jinn family who are actually sensitive to Islam, but there's others who didn't. And that's the debate then. You look at this, what I think is archaic history. So you're looking at something that was remodeled as it came through, but it's much older. It's much older. The belief in Jinn probably predates Islam, in my view.
Now, you have a few books on the table here, and these are by Islamic scholars, are they not?
Well, Gordon Crichton, who was my mentor, who started Flying Saucer Review probably about 1955, he was around. He did speak Arabic, and he certainly talked to scholars around the world about Jinn because he was concerned. There's also an article I've got somewhere here about the infrared possibilities and the idea that all these entities come from a spectrum, if you like, and he felt that Jinn particularly fitted that. And it's almost like we could call it an etheric spectrum. So we live in the world of solid matter. What the older views are, this phrase that the Jinn come from something called smokeless fire. And in the references in this book, which is the Jinn in the Quran and Sunnah, they talk about smokeless fire being the tips of a flame. So for me, I don't necessarily believe it's fire that people are seeing. They're seeing an ether-like substance. So when I mean ether, it's a liquid medium that is disproved in modern science. But that doesn't mean a lot. But it's actually a substance that is behind all reality, is a liquid medium. And when things come through, they behave like a smoke or an oily liquid. And when people describe entities, when they form, which is the most important for me, is when I look into an entity encounter, is how an entity forms and how it leaves, because you get an idea of its substance. So this smokiness, this smokeless fire is real, in that people describe entities coming in as boiling steam, and then they form into a solid entity. So that for me is straight away, Gordon Crichton's view was, this is an infrared, far red spectrum of some kind of etheric energy.
So we're not saying, though, that all Jinn come across as evil or malevolent, like the traditional view, let's say in Christianity and other areas, of demons. That some of them can be very helpful.
Well, this is the interesting thing on this book. It's called The Jinn and then Demons in brackets. Oh. And again, these are all anthologies of quotes.
There you go.
So for me, even the word demon itself, because it's Greek derived as far as I know, it describes entities from a particular place. Then it became, I'll use the term Christianized, and became a representation of evil. So where Pan becomes the devil, etc., we change culture. And I believe that we're looking at the Jinn are similar, that people unfortunately culturally coloured them in.
So you say that these Jinn that have been there for a long time, they've been known about and widely accepted in the Middle Eastern world, that they're sort of like another multi-dimensional intelligence around us, observing us, interacting with us, maybe influencing our thoughts, attaching to people, taking up residence in places. They're sort of like astral wildlife, you could say, but very ancient from the sounds of it.
Well, yeah, exactly. Now, when you go to talk to people who understand fairies and they understand some of these other strange creatures that align with fairies, it gets so weird that one of these beings can get embedded in you. Now, it sounds outrageous to us, but then we live in a 3D world with time. What I'm saying is there is something else happening in a multi-layered dimension, and these entities get stuck to you. They get, in some way, through some kind of anomaly, and people get some very strange effects. Some of them are like madness. So the classic description from someone who's Islamic will say, well, a person they knew got caught up with a jinn and then became quite mad or dangerous or weren't themselves. They had a personality change. Now, this is the fundamental fear that people have of jinn, that they become taken over and they become demonic. They're no longer the person that people know them as, and then they use clerics to get that out of them. They use verses from the Quran to get them out. It's very specific. I think there's 2 verses specifically that they use, and when they say these, they become released.
I definitely believe in that. They say that you have a few kilos already of these microorganisms that are living on you already.
Full of bacteria.
Absolutely, that they're oscillating with you, right? And I've often thought that each and every single one of you watching to any of us, we have these countless other energetic forms that are with us, and they've attached to us, and they're moving with us based on our lifestyles, what kind of moods we're in, our thoughts. Everything we do is oscillating with them. So I can only imagine the jinn work the same way.
Well, this is it. They are a natural ecosystem. They're an environment, and that's the key to it. They're not something odd.
Yes.
We're from an environment where there are non-physical states that we don't understand that then intersect with us, and some of them manifest. And because we don't have any kind of cultural model for this, it's just dismissed. So for me, when I listen to somebody who says, there was a particular lady I'm thinking of now, as an Afghan lady, and she woke up with a man sitting on her hip, but he wasn't a human. He was like a bat-like face with a very long nose. He was quite scary, frightening for her. She woke up in the night and he was perched on her pelvis on the side of her hip where she was lying on her side.
Can you imagine waking up to that?
Yeah, and it was staring into her and looking at her, and she sensed danger and she started reciting her verses, and it took a few of them to get it off her.
What were these scriptures from the Quran?
These were the ones that everyone seems to know in Islam that they use. So she had a physical entity. Now, other person who spoke to me about their experience in the actual mosque, they could hear a woman's voice, a remote voice, which means nobody's there but just the voice of laughter moving around. Now, again, from people who've had encounters, these things, remote voice phenomenon, happen. And what they felt was one of the people there had attached to a jinn, and they brought it into the mosque, and then it was manifesting. And again, a senior cleric got it out.
Wow.
So these are the everyday kind of possession types. And then you've got the entity type, like the lady who woke up. And then I have a non-Muslim who had a Qatar experience in June 2014, and I published this in FSR.
And this is in the Flying Saucer Review, everyone. If you check it out, this is the magazine that's been published since 1954, is it?
Yeah, it started in 54, and it was really the establishment. People from diplomatic backgrounds, people with titles, people from aviation backgrounds, they got together and they tried to deal with UFOs, and then that branched out into all entities and what the true nature of existence is. Pretty deep.
And this is one of the most distinguished, if not the most distinguished magazines ever published, not only in the UK but abroad, on the subject of UFOs.
It was in classical terms. I mean, what I've done with it is to try and create much more investigation and direct accounts. That's what I want. So people can have opinions, but they have to tie them to evidence.
Yes.
That's where the subject has to go. So if there's a great line from Stanton Friedman, he said, people like to proclaim evidence. You can't proclaim it. You have to define it by case encounters and people's experiences,
Yes.
and then draw conclusions from observation.
That's brilliant. Let me ask you another question, because I know that the subject of Jinn and the unknown and these beings is something you've looked at for a long time, but you have an incredible amount of case files here in your offices on ufology.
Yeah.
And you have spent so much time in the field investigating these subjects and talking to UFO experiencers and contactees. Where do you see the Jinn fitting into the subject of extraterrestrial contact? And do you think that some ETs have been mistaken for Jinn and vice versa?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, you're looking at anatomical descriptions. So for me, the classic alien entity is a skeletal type humanoid form.
Yes.
So they usually are quite underweight, and we think that's because of genetic modification and they're being bred through cloning, etc. So they are a classic entity will be a very long-armed, very skinny entity that will appear as a bedroom visitor. Now, what I've heard from most of the Muslims I've talked to, that's not what they're getting. So they're getting much. So I believe that would be an alien civilization. If I saw an entity like that in a description, I'd say that's from an alien civilization. What I think we're dealing with is actually native creatures to this planet who aren't technological necessarily, but they have like a wild version. So you have technological entities that us Westerners experience, and you could say that's cultural. And then I think the Islamic experience is of wild entities, and I believe fairies are included in wild entities. So I go for like even what people call nature spirits. These are all wild entities. These are intelligences, but they're not necessarily technological. They're not necessarily even, involved in progression like we are, because human progress is something very human. These entities may quite happily exist for thousands of years without any technological advances. That's what I believe.
Absolutely. And I think you said something very important when you brought it back to your mentor, the great Gordon Crichton, who was it was an MI6 agent, correct?
He said to me that once that he was the equivalent rank in civilian terms would have been colonel.
Okay.
And he was a man who worked in the anti-communist office, and he spoke multiple languages, possibly many as 16, and he was analysing defence implications of Soviets and the Chinese communists, which he did during the Cold War.
But he was extremely brilliant, and he was an extraordinary researcher that looked into these areas, and these were some of his favorite cases to look into with the Jinn. Now, he said that there was a connection over to infrared. So when we think about the human light spectrum, when you think what's at the visible light spectrum, I know that when we look at how our eye works, it's almost an extension of the brain. It's its own brain. When you look at the optic nerve and the visual cortices, there's a very narrow light spectrum where light comes in. And when we start to look into these things, we start to find out all kinds of things existing in the infrared as well as ultraviolet. So all around us at any given time, we can only imagine, Harry, that in this room, even with us, there are all sorts of beings. And if you get somebody that is a very powerful clairvoyant, and there are people amongst us that do have these abilities, that they can see beyond this and they look at these things, they can see what's operating around us. And you can only imagine that, just like we talked about how there was Muslim Jinn and there was non-Muslim Jinn, and then there's fairies and sort of wild spirits, nature spirits, you were saying that they would be attracted to people that have certain predilections, people that have these certain proclivities and things that they do that they find amusing. Some of the old Irish fairy tales, we learn about there's certain times when these encounters would take place, what we call a tween time or a tween place. And it said the old Irish wisdom, as you know, you've spent a lot of time out there talking to people about fairies and encounters, is that fairies like to gather around people who tell stories and they sing often. So if you get somebody who was involved in certain sorts of creative endeavors, you might get creative Jinn. You might get artistic Jinn. Now, I wanted to ask you the next question. Do you suppose that these Jinn have helped certain people on our planets, let's say like a Nikola Tesla or an Einstein, or they've helped urged along?
Tesla would wake up with multiple components fully designed in his mind that would have downloaded, and then he would... So I think one occasion he had 15, I think I remember reading some of these unofficial accounts, different components, all lined up so he could actually form like these very early days of electronics that he was involved in. And there's particularly this idea of tuning circuits, which Marconi hadn't even figured out. And then Tesla basically opened up the radio waves.
It was Tesla that invented the radio, not Marconi.
Yeah. And what my belief, the weird thing is, Marconi then turns up in about 1933 during an Italian UFO crash. And he's there with Mussolini and Mussolini's son-in-law and various others looking at the first crashed UFO in 33 that we know about, which was in northern Italy. And he appears. So what's interesting then is Mussolini's son-in-law in 1935 is in Shanghai with Gordon Crichton, who's posted in Shanghai, and they know each other. So the man who saw the first UFO that crash landed that we know about was working and friends with Gordon Crichton, Mussolini's son-in-law. That's the peculiar thing, isn't it? How the world works. So I would say I've interviewed a lot of people who are musically trained who have encounters, and that's the most interesting. The musicians that have paranormal encounters. There's so many that I've met that are musicians. So that's to do with brainwaves.
So these Jinn are there, and I think one day we're going to get to a level where we're going to be able to measure where they are. And I think even on places where people have disturbed and they've been building houses, or they've had a weird disturbance in energy or strange experiences, there's all kinds of explanations that we could get. Maybe geophysical anomalies, things that caused, glitches in time, space, and all that to show up. But the Jinn could possibly be in some of these places. Do you think one day we'll be able to measure them and see them and know where they are?
I look at repeat encounters, and the first thing you notice is the presence of water springs or old water springs.
Why is that? Why does that affect
the spin of the water? There's actually a vortex type behavior. When you've got water under pressure moving underground, you get vortices.
That's what Maria Wheatley says.
Now that's the first thing. Then you're looking at fault lines where there seems to be like geo energy which is released, and then I often look at a big drop on a fault line with a spring activity and chalk, because now this is only familiar to France and the UK, which has more chalk than anywhere else. That there is an electrical charge in chalk, which a lot of the crop circle researchers were aware of.
In Wiltshire.
So that presumably electrostatics. So people are experiencing electrostatic charge, moving water, and ionization, and then some kind of amplification. So if you try and measure that, it's in micro voltages. I met someone years ago who was measuring Silbury Hill on the, I think it was the winter solstice, and they were just seeing it was in micro voltages, and they barely picked up anything. So for me, the missing element is the tuning, which is exactly what Tesla was about. These devices, these monuments that I think of as Avebury Stone Circle, the Silbury Hill, they're completely dead to us because they are not tuned. But my belief is that there was some other lost science, which of course you're an Egyptologist among other things, that there is actually a tuning technology that we're missing. So we see an inert pile of rock, or we see an inert, because what was interesting, I happened to run into a chap who did studies on why did they shut down certain monuments in the Bronze Age and the Neolithic Age, and he said what was interesting, when the water table changed, the spring dried up, and they moved the monument to the next active spring. Isn't that interesting?
Well, it's interesting. So Maria Wheatley was telling me that when you looked at Stonehenge originally, there was this water that was coming up from the bottom of a hole in one of the rocks, if I remember correctly. I'm just paraphrasing. This water was coming up, and people were getting healing from it. It was because of the type of the spin and the water that was coming out of it. And they later on, they ended up plugging that hole. But there was something about the water that was coming up. There was a spin. It was a healing property. The drainage of this country in agricultural terms, I mean, it's completely changed. Since that was built, the water table would have been dramatically changed. But for me, that's some of the ideas for me, that there is a vortex type reality where these things can then transit. Now, what we're looking at in terms of the classic Arab view is if you travel to a ruin or an empty buildings, if you're out in the dark in a deserted place with dead trees. Now, what's interesting for me, dead trees, people who douse know dead trees are right at the hot spot in a spring. I know there's no springs in the desert, so don't get me wrong. We may be talking something subterranean that might be way down,
But dead trees around a spring is something that's interesting.
That is interesting.
And abandoned buildings, we're looking at an ancient architecture.
And another thing,
desert buildings that are ancient.
Another thing you've told me on a lot of these sites where there's an incredible energy, which is strange that there's weird suicides and bizarre things that go on at these sites with this kind of activity. Why is that?
Well, this is something that the crop circle researchers looked into just randomly. I can tell you there was a place called the Westbury Triangle. And during the 90s, there were clusters of very strange human behaviour, some of them very sinister, that happened in Westbury. Now, people couldn't understand why these sudden clusters were appearing. Now, we get cancer clusters, which again were something called geopathic stress and electrostress. So your stress is from high voltage man-made sources, and geopathic stress is meant to be from fault lines and underground rivers. But the concept was you got these ionization hotspots. So people got ill. Yes. But for some reason, there was also extreme human behaviours. So we're talking about some very dark stuff. And these are questionable. I mean, I'm looking at why are certain places considered Jinn sources.
Well, I want to ask you about that because you and I have discussed this before. You know that show, The Outlanders?
Yes.
And it's there's these stones where there's like portals and things like that. And we also see Jinn associated with certain sites and places.
Yeah.
Is that connected to these springs and water and geomagnetic anomalies?
I think you can have springs without water. That's the key to it. That the actual rotation, because we're very physical. We always think, oh, you need something physical, so we've got to have water. Now, we know the deserts are bereft of it, but is it possible that we're looking at, so this is the way I look at planetary positions as well, the ideas of like forces, these fluidic forces that are moving, rather than water itself is following defects, if you like, and paths of least resistance. But are we looking at an etheric spin that is actually associated with water springs?
So the water's behavior is being dictated due to the geophysical anomalies in that area, so you could have springs without water.
That's what I'm thinking.
Wow,
now this
that's
is an interesting case.
Everyone.
Because Qatar's in the news at the moment, the World Cup. We have somebody who's closely associated with me, who I know very well for the last 20 years. She had a Jinn experience. Now, she fits the classic. She was living in Qatar. You only go out in the late night and evening. She went out into the desert, actually got lost in the desert, got rescued, thankfully, because obviously she must have had a phone with her. Someone got her out. She arrives home in this Viva Baraya, a beautiful development, one of those beautiful developments they have on the coast. And she goes to bed, and then a figure appears at the end of her bed, and she's paralyzed. So she's now getting a paralysis experience.
Incredible.
The figure he's ill-defined, but he's watching her, and then she starts feeling herself being pushed into the bed, and there's a vortex, isn't it interesting, over her body, driving her into the bed. He's trying to take her.
Incredible.
Now, she's a non-denominational person, but she's brought up in Italy with Christianity, and she implores God to save her, which is activating the higher power. And this figure is finally pushed out. Now, this is the interesting thing. I wrote an article about this, and I also included a Kenyan case from a Kikuyu who had a similar experience, funny enough, involving a wind entering her room. And she was taken. Now, she was taken. This lady, the Italian lady, was able to defeat whatever it was and wasn't taken. The Kenyan lady was taken, and this is the strangest thing. She was taken to see sick people. And she was given visions and seeing people who were ill by this entity. So it wasn't something sinister. She goes to her cleric and she says to her, you must pray to stop these events, this thing coming into your room. She tries it and it doesn't work. Works maybe the first time, which is what this article was about, was the fact that it's not always consistent. People want it to be. If you're a religious person, you want it to work every time. But it's the higher power in you that creates the defense.
Absolutely.
It's not the words.
You call on the archetype that strengthens you. And I think that's fascinating because there is a correlation to people that have had these experiences where they've had a religious defense, whether it is an Abrahamic one or a Buddhism or whatever it is, they call on it. But the most amazing thing is that in Islam, they have very much documented
two verses that they use,
Do you have the two verses?
I haven't, but I can get them easily enough. By the time this goes, I could just get the quotes, because I know people who know.
Well, we most certainly have to follow up with this, and we have to go further in these cases. But Harry, mate, I want to say this is truly fascinating, and I know that FSR has covered it. I know you've been looking at this for years, and we have to revisit this and go even further. But before we wrap things up today on this episode, there's a movie that you were telling me about, and we watched together before this show was put together, and you were telling me that it's one of your favorite movies that almost captures this Sufism. It's filmed in Morocco, and it shows the Jinn aspects that everybody can go look up. What is it?
It's called Babaziz, which means little butterfly, apparently. It's about a little girl travelling with her blind grandfather looking for this very strange Sufi meeting.
And it's one of your favorite films, you
For
said.
the reason of it's a very beautiful film, but it carries a lot of strange ideas from Sufism. Now, there's something that Sufis talk about that is from the desert, which is the world of the imaginal, not imagination, but imaginal. Okay. And it's a connection between your mind and what's real and you see around you, and the magic of the imaginal brings in other types of experience. So this film, I mean, my belief, it has a Jinn scene, which I've showed you, not the most extraordinary thing.
It's beautiful.
A man jumps down a well, he crosses, and again a spring, a well, yes. He crosses into the dimension of the Jinn, and they look after him and pamper him and then trick him into going out, and he can't find his way back in. So it's very much like fairy lore. I interview people who've entered the fairy domain. You cannot get out when you're in it, and then when you're out of it, you can't get back in.
That reminds me of the old Disney movie with Sean Connery that is called Darby O'Gill and the Little People. And in the movie, there's a story where Darby, and of course Sean Connery is in it, but Darby is going up to the ruins of Naklashiga, and he gets tricked by King Brian, and King Brian O'Connor's is he, and he brings him down into the fairy world through a well. He falls down into the well.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, and then he sends for him with his the trooping fairies send for him and bring him into the fairy kingdom. It's a really beautiful movie. Everybody should watch it.
Trooping fairies means marching fairies. So when anyone says, I've seen trooping, now the weird thing is, all the way through the folklore stories, people see trooping fairies. So it's like an army of fairies. And I have actually met a number of witnesses who've actually seen trooping fairies. So they're like a population. They're not just one. We're talking about populations.
I think we should follow this show up next time and go into the fairy world.
Fairy kingdom.
The fairy kingdom. Absolutely. I think it's a great subject to go into because it's a serious subject. And if you go to Ireland, especially Southern Ireland, and you go to these particular areas, nobody will disturb a fairy mound. And it's
or a tree, a blackthorn or a whitethorn tree.
It's a very real thing there, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very real thing, and if you talk to people over there, they take it very seriously. Maybe not in Dublin. If you go to Dublin, people are very superstitious, and they'll say, well, the fairy stories are just talking about the times when the Irish were going through a difficult time through the famines and everything, and they'll say this is a personification of that, but there's a whole lot more to it, and it goes back a long ways. Harry, I want to say this has been absolutely great to talk to you. We're going to have all of your contact details down below in the description where people can find you.
And they can put their own experiences. Anyone who's had a Jinn or a fairy experience, just write a quick summary.
Put them in the comments. Or how can they get a hold of you?
Well, there's an FSR.org website, which is there. It's old, but it's there. And you can email me on the lanula9@aol.com. And the Lanula 9, if you don't know what a Lanula is, it was the golden ark that the pre-Druids, it's the Bronze Age golden ark. And it is actually something we'll talk about at some point, because the Lanula is something that's completely bypassed. People thought it was a decorative piece of high priest wear, but actually there was a chap called Michael Poinder who looked at the ark, looked at the shape of the Lanula, and started looking at the stone circles and started to notice that there was he was a dowser. And he was looking at the idea that the Lanula was far more. It was like a planisphere, or it was negotiating the planetary and star positions, the azimuths and positions of the moon, the extremes. You're looking at a mapping technology.
It's incredible.
And again, we believe you stick it on the head, because that's what people who've got degrees say. You just put it on your head. But the fact that people aren't looking at sacred geometry. I mean, when did a scientist... I mean, what they'll do is they'll do it empirically. They'll take a sacred geometry site and make a joke about it. But really, I'm talking about applied energy technology. We don't have a blooming clue what that would look like. If you had an energy system that was remote, that involved vibration or sound waves or light waves or all of those, this technology is what these beings are using, and we don't have. So we can't get back into the world of these jinn or any other types of entity because we don't have the key.
That's exactly right. And that's why when you delve deeper into these stories and you find out how it works, whether it is these wells, whether it's the springs, whether it's these areas of Earth, absolutely, you can trace them, and we can start to understand that there is a science here. And that's what we're trying to do. And that's what we want to go deeper with Harry Challenger. Everybody, remember to like, subscribe, comment down below, as Harry said, share this video with your friends, and we will talk to you all soon on the next video.